He thought he had built a perfect life, a respected millionaire, a loving grandfather, and a legacy clean of secrets at least. That's what he believed. But everything changed on a quiet Sunday afternoon, when a 6-year-old boy tugged at his hand, pointed across the playground, and said something that shattered his world. "Grandpa, that boy over there, he's my brother." In that moment, time stopped. His breath caught in his throat. He knew his grandson had never seen that child before. But what came next revealed a past he tried to bury decades ago, a past that refused to stay silent. If you think this is just another story, think again, because what you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about family, love, and truth. Enjoy the story. It all started with a simple promise. Every Sunday, Grandpa Thomas would pick up little Eli and take him to the same park where he used to take Eli's father decades ago. It was their sacred time. No business calls, no distractions, just stories, sandwiches, and squirrel chasing. Thomas was a man of traditions, and ever since his retirement, those moments with his grandson were the only thing that truly made him feel alive. He had built his empire with numbers and strategy, but this little boy, with messy hair and a laugh that echoed like sunshine, reminded him what truly mattered. That day, the weather was perfect. Blue skies, the scent of grass in the air, and children's laughter dancing between the trees. Nothing could have warned him that the illusion of peace he cherished was about to implode. They sat on their usual bench, the one with the chipped corner and initials carved from a time when love was young and careless. Eli munched on his peanut butter sandwich while Grandpa told him stories from the old days, half of them exaggerated just enough to spark wonder in the boy's wide eyes. But then, Eli went quiet. His gaze locked on something across the playground. Thomas followed his line of sight and saw a young boy, about the same age, playing alone by the slide. The child had dark curls, the same stubborn eyebrows as Thomas's son, and a smile that felt eerily familiar. "Do you know him?" Thomas asked casually, but Eli didn't even blink. He just whispered, "Grandpa, that's my brother." And suddenly, the air turned heavy. Thomas froze. For a moment, he thought he had misheard. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice barely above a breath. "That's my brother," Eli repeated, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Thomas's mind began to spiral. He knew his son had only one child. He knew there were no siblings, no divorces, no stepkids, no hidden cousins. So who was this boy? And why did Eli say it with such certainty? Panic wrestled with confusion. He stood up, his heart pounding in his chest, and took Eli's hand. "Let's go meet him," he said, trying to stay calm. But deep down, something old and painful had already begun to stir. Something he had buried long ago, and it was now clawing its way back into the light. As Thomas walked across the playground, holding Eli's small hand tightly, his mind began unraveling memories he thought had turned to dust. Each step toward the unknown boy felt like walking deeper into a memory he couldn't quite place, a memory stitched with guilt, love, and something he hadn't dared name in decades. The boy stood by the slide, fiddling with a toy car, completely unaware of the storm brewing and the man approaching him. Thomas studied his face, the shape of his nose, the arch of his brow, the slight tilt of his smile. Familiar, painfully so. "Hey there, champ," Thomas said, crouching slightly. "What's your name?" The boy looked up with bright, trusting eyes and replied, "Danny." The name hit Thomas like a slap, not because of what it was, but because of what it could mean. Before he could speak again, a woman came rushing over. She looked young but worn, maybe in her early 30s, with tired eyes that spoke of long nights and unspoken burdens. Her clothes were simple, her posture guarded. "Danny, come here, sweetheart," she said softly, taking the boy's hand with practiced gentleness. Then her eyes met Thomas's, and they froze. Something passed between them, a flicker of recognition, a shadow of the past clawing its way into the present. Thomas stared at her, stunned. He knew that face, or at least a version of it. "Are you Rachel's daughter?" he asked, the question escaping before he could stop it. The woman blinked, confused. "How do you know my mother's name?" she asked cautiously, tightening her grip on Danny. And just like that, the past cracked open. Rachel. The name echoed through Thomas's chest like an old love song, one that ended on a bitter note. She had been everything to him once, a soft rebellion against the life his parents tried to force on him. Rachel, the brilliant librarian, with a laugh like wind chimes and a heart big enough to love him despite his family's disdain. But when duty called, he left, and by the time he tried to return to her, she was gone. No trace, no goodbye, just silence. Now, standing before him was a woman who could only be her child, and next to her, a boy who looked uncannily like both her and Thomas's own son. But if Rachel had a daughter, and this woman had a son, why would Eli, his only grandson, call Danny his brother? The puzzle was tightening, and it was only the beginning. Thomas couldn't shake the weight pressing down on his chest as he drove home later that evening. Eli had fallen asleep in the back seat, his small body curled up like nothing had happened, like the word brother hadn't sent a dagger through time. But Thomas's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than they had in years. He replayed the woman's face in his mind, Rachel's daughter. Her name was Sarah, she had said, and she didn't give much more. Just that she'd grown up, with a single mother who spoke little about the past and never mentioned Thomas by name. But the resemblance was undeniable. And Danny had that same spark in his eyes, the same spark that Thomas remembered seeing in the mirror when he was a young man in love. It was like time had bent backward and birthed a ghost. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the expensive kind he usually saved for holidays, and sat alone in his den, the flicker of the fireplace dancing across the old photo frames on the mantel. One by one, he scanned the faces of his family, his late wife, kind but distant, his only son Michael, whom he had raised with discipline and structure, not tenderness, and Eli, the little boy who was growing into a mirror of both men, yet now, maybe not the only grandson after all. Could it be? Could Rachel have been pregnant when she left? Could Sarah have grown up never knowing the truth and passed that silence on to her own child? Or was there something deeper, a connection even he had missed? The possibility that Michael himself might have secrets, ones he never dared to confess. The next morning, Thomas made a decision, one he had avoided for years. He opened the old storage chest in his attic. It was buried beneath Christmas decorations and unopened boxes of memories he wasn't ready to face. Inside, he found it, a faded leather journal, wrapped in a silk ribbon, and beneath it, letters, dozens of them, all from Rachel, unread, still sealed. He had never been brave enough to open them after receiving the first one, years ago. He had told himself it was better that way, that the past needed to stay buried. But now, with Eli's words echoing like a prophecy, he knew the time had come. His hands trembled as he slit the first envelope. The paper crackled, and Rachel's voice returned, gentle, desperate, and full of truths he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. The paper was yellowed, delicate, as if time itself had tried to erase the message before Thomas could read it. But her handwriting was unmistakable, flowing, elegant, and full of emotion even in the first line. Thomas, if you're reading this, it means you finally found the courage to open what your heart couldn't years ago. The words cut deep. Rachel hadn't written to beg or accuse. Instead, the letter read like a confession wrapped in love, telling him how she waited at the station the day he promised to return, how she held on to hope for weeks, then months, and how eventually, with a child growing inside her and no word from him, she chose to move on. "I never hated you," she wrote. "I just couldn't keep waiting for someone who may have never truly loved me." Thomas's throat tightened. He had loved her, but he had also been a coward. The second letter was dated 6 months later. In it, Rachel described the birth of a daughter, Sarah. "She has your eyes," she wrote, "and sometimes when she laughs, it echoes like yours. I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted you to know she exists, that you left something beautiful behind." Thomas set the letter down, trembling. He had a daughter he had never met, and that daughter had a son, Danny, the boy who stood by the slide, with Eli calling him brother, a child born of the very blood Thomas tried to erase. He felt sick. Guilt crashed over him in waves, heavier than any storm he had weathered in business or life. How had he missed this? How had he allowed silence to rob him of a family he didn't even know existed? But there was one more letter, one that would change everything. It was shorter, written in shaky handwriting, and dated nearly 7 years ago, the year his wife passed away. "Thomas," it began, "I saw Michael at the grocery store. He didn't recognize me. He's grown into a fine man. I never told Sarah the whole truth about you, but I must tell you something now, before I no longer can. Michael might not be just your son." Thomas froze. The room went still. The fireplace crackled in the silence like a slow-burning fuse. His mind spiraled. Could it be? No. Impossible. But the letter continued. I made a terrible mistake, one I couldn't face back then. If Michael ever learns the truth, please be gentle. It wasn't his fault, or yours, that was it. No signature, no explanation, just a single sentence that shattered his understanding of everything. Michael might not be just your son. Thomas sat in the dark for hours, the final letter still in his hands, as though letting go of the paper would make the truth vanish. But the words echoed louder than ever, crawling under his skin and refusing to let go. Michael might not be just your son. What did she mean? Was there someone else? Had Rachel been with another man around the same time? Or could it be that she never told the full story, that Michael was born from a secret that neither of them ever dared to face? The thought was unbearable. Thomas had raised Michael with pride, invested everything he had into his future. Their relationship had been rocky at times, but Thomas never doubted his love for his son. Now, that foundation was cracking. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. The next day, Thomas did something he swore he'd never do. He called Michael. Not for small talk, not for a casual dinner invitation, but with urgency in his voice and a weight in his chest. I need to talk to you, he said. It's important. Come by tonight. Michael hesitated, but agreed. He arrived that evening, casual as ever, unaware that his entire identity was about to be questioned. They sat in the same den where the letters had shattered Thomas's world. At first, Thomas didn't know where to begin. How do you tell a grown man that the woman you once loved hinted, maybe even confessed, that he might not be your biological child? But then he thought of Eli, of Danny, of the future they deserved. Michael, he said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Michael's smile faded. What is this about? He asked, suddenly tense. Thomas reached for the letter and handed it over. I received this from someone years ago, someone I once loved very much. Michael read the note slowly, his brows furrowing as the words sank in. When he looked up, his face had turned pale. You're telling me I might not be your son? He asked, voice tight, eyes glinting with something between anger and fear. Thomas shook his head. I'm not telling you anything. I'm asking you what you know. About Rachel, about your mother, about anything that might make sense of this. Michael stood up, pacing, breathing hard. I don't know what this means, he said. My mother never told me anything. She hated talking about the past. But if what you're saying is true, then who am I? The question hung in the air like smoke, and neither of them had an answer. For the first time in his life, Thomas saw Michael as a boy again, not the stern, composed man who had led board meetings and raised his voice in arguments, but a lost child, stripped of identity. He watched as his son paced the room, rubbing his temples, avoiding eye contact, as if running from a ghost he couldn't name. This can't be real, Michael muttered. I mean, you raised me. You taught me everything. You're my father. Thomas nodded slowly, the ache in his chest growing sharper. I am your father, he said. Nothing will ever change that. But if Rachel told the truth, if there's even a chance, he paused. The silence between them was deafening. Michael finally stopped pacing. Are you asking for a test? He said. A DNA test. And Thomas hated himself for saying yes, but he did, because the not knowing was already eating him alive. The days that followed moved with excruciating slowness. They scheduled the test, trying to act like it was just a formality, like it didn't carry the weight of decades. Michael tried to keep busy at work, but Thomas could see the shift in his tone, his posture, even in how he spoke to Eli. The boy was too young to understand, but he could feel something was off. Why's Daddy sad? He asked one night, and Thomas didn't know how to answer. He spent more time with Eli than usual, telling longer stories at bedtime, taking extra walks, trying to memorize every moment in case everything changed. But it wasn't just Michael who was waiting. Thomas had also reached out to Sarah, Rachel's daughter, and asked for a meeting. He needed to know more about Rachel, about her timeline, about the man she might have loved after him. When Sarah agreed to meet, they chose a quiet cafe outside the city, far from curious eyes. She arrived carrying a small notebook, Rachel's journal, passed down after her death. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. I didn't want to read all of it, she confessed. But after you showed up, after what Danny said, I started looking for answers too. Page after page revealed fragments of a life Rachel had fought to protect, She had never married, had never stopped loving Thomas, according to her words, and then, toward the end, a single line underlined in blue ink. Michael was never meant to be a secret. But I thought protecting him meant keeping the truth buried. Thomas felt his throat close. Sarah looked at him with tears in her eyes. What if we're all part of the same story, just told in different pieces? She whispered, and for the first time, Thomas didn't feel like a man who had made mistakes. He felt like a man on the edge of understanding his entire legacy. The envelope arrived on a grey Thursday morning, the kind of day where the sky looked like it was holding its breath. Thomas stared at it for hours before opening it. He didn't want to know, he needed to know. But some part of him hoped reality could stay suspended just a little longer. The seal tore open like a wound, and there it was. The truth, printed in sterile black ink. The DNA test was conclusive. Michael was not Thomas's biological son. Thomas didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just sat there, the silence of the room pressing in on him like a tomb. A lifetime of fatherhood, coaching Little League, building legues, grounding him for sneaking out at 16. Watching him graduate, all of it now floated in a strange, undefined space. Was it real? Had it all been a lie? Or was this something deeper? When he called Michael, there was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting. Just two men, sitting on opposite ends of a phone line, trying to breathe through the collapse of a lifetime. "It's confirmed," Thomas said, voice dry. Michael was quiet. "I figured," he whispered. "I've been thinking. The way Mom never wanted to talk about you. The way she kept certain things locked away. I always thought she was just protecting herself. But maybe she was protecting me from the truth." Thomas sighed. "I still see you as my son," he said. "That won't change. But I need you to know something else. Sarah is Rachel's daughter. Danny might be your half-brother, or your son's." There was a pause, a long, cold silence. "What?" Michael said. "You're saying Eli and Danny could be brothers?" Thomas felt the weight of it all crashing in. "That's what we need to find out next." That night, Thomas sat Eli down on the porch, watching the stars flicker above them. "Do you remember Danny?" he asked softly. Eli nodded. "He's nice. We played with trucks. He looks like me." Thomas smiled faintly. "Yes, he does." He hesitated, then said, "How did you know he was your brother?" Eli shrugged, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "I just felt it, in here." He pointed to his chest, like, "I've known him forever." Thomas felt his throat tighten. Maybe children sensed what adults ignored, the echoes that passed through blood. The bonds written in something deeper than names or papers. That night, Thomas made a decision. Another test. One more envelope. And this time, the truth would either heal what was broken, or shatter what remained. The test between Eli and Danny was done quietly. No one spoke much during the clinic visit. Sarah held Danny's hand while Michael kept his arm around Eli, trying to mask the storm inside. Thomas watched it all unfold like a scene from a movie he never asked to be in. He had built his life around logic, control, and legacy. Yet, here he was, standing in a fluorescently room, while strangers swabbed the inside of two boys' cheeks, searching for answers that should have belonged to love, not science. Eli didn't understand why they were there, but he could sense the weight of the moment. He looked at Danny and whispered, "It's okay, we're already brothers." Danny nodded, shy but calm, as if a secret had already been spoken between them long ago, far from adult ears. The days waiting for the results passed in a haze. Michael and Sarah began speaking more frequently, both orbiting around the shared unknown that connected their children. Late one evening, Sarah called Thomas, "My mother. She always said there were some things we'd never understand until we were parents ourselves." She said, "I didn't get it, but now, watching Danny and Eli play together, it feels like they've known each other their whole lives. It's strange, it's beautiful, and it's terrifying." Thomas agreed. He had seen the same thing in their faces, that invisible thread, undeniable and quiet. At one point, he even caught himself imagining how life might have been different if Rachel had stayed, if none of this had been buried. But regrets don't change reality. Only truth does. And truth was finally on its way. When the results arrived, Thomas was the first to open them alone. Again, in the silence of his study, his hands shook, the page blurred. But then, there it was. A match. High probability. Eli and Danny shared the same father. Thomas leaned back, eyes closed. It was real, undeniable. Michael had fathered both boys, Eli through his marriage, and Danny through something else. He didn't know when, he didn't know how, but the truth was clear. He was now the grandfather of 2 boys, half-brothers, bound by blood, divided by silence, and Michael had a secret he had never confessed. Thomas felt the air leave his lungs. This wasn't just about Rachel anymore. This was about Michael's choices, and the reckoning had just begun. Thomas didn't wait long. That same evening, he called Michael to the house. No vague pleasantries, no stalling. The envelope sat open on the desk like a wound that refused to close. When Michael arrived, Thomas didn't greet him with a handshake or a hug. He simply slid the paper across the table. "They're brothers," he said flatly. Michael's face stiffened, but his eyes betrayed it all. Recognition, guilt, and something deeper, something ancient. He didn't pick up the paper. He didn't need to. "I know," he whispered. That single confession cut through the air like a blade. "You knew?" Thomas asked, his voice rising for the first time in days. "You knew Eli had a brother out there, and you said nothing?" Michael finally looked him in the eyes. "It wasn't that simple," he said. But Thomas wasn't ready for explanations. Not yet. The betrayal ran too deep. Michael sank into the chair, elbows on knees, hands gripping his face. "I met Sarah years ago," he began, voice hollow. "It was before Eli, before my marriage. We were both lost. It was one night, maybe 2. I never knew she was pregnant. We never spoke again. I didn't even remember her name until the day you showed me the letter, and when I saw her at the park, I knew that boy was mine. He looked exactly like me." Thomas couldn't believe what he was hearing. "And you didn't say anything? Not even when Eli pointed him out? When Sarah stood in front of you?" Michael shook his head. "I panicked. I didn't know what to do. I have a family, a reputation. I thought maybe if I ignored it, it would go away. But secrets don't dissolve. They root themselves." In the cracks and grow-dot, Thomas stood silently, pacing the room like a storm in slow motion. "You let that boy grow up without knowing his father," he said, each word soaked in bitterness. "You let me believe I had one grandson, and all this time, there were 2. Michael stood up, voice breaking. "I was ashamed. I didn't want to break my life apart. I didn't know how to face it. I didn't even know you weren't my real father until a week ago. And now you want me to just..." But Thomas cut him off. "This isn't about you anymore, Michael. It's about Eli. It's about Danny. It's about what kind of men we raise them to be. Do you want them to grow up hiding, ashamed of where they come from? Or do we face the truth and own it?" The room went still. The silence said more than any words ever could. And in that silence, something shifted. The reckoning had begun, but so had redemption. The next few days passed in a strange quiet, not the kind that brings peace, but the kind that fills every room with the echo of things left unsaid. Thomas knew this silence well. It had followed him after Rachel left, after his wife passed, and now again, after truth had torn through their lives like a storm. But this time, he wasn't going to sit in it. He called Sarah. "Bring Danny," he said gently. "I think it's time the boys had a day together. Just them. No DNA, no drama. Just a chance for them to be kids, to laugh, to feel normal." Sarah agreed. Michael too, though his guilt hung around him like fog. That Sunday, they returned to the park, the same one where everything had unraveled. But this time, they came not as strangers, not as broken pieces, but as something closer to family. Eli and Danny took to each other like magnets, as if no time had passed since that first day. They played with sticks, invented imaginary kingdoms, and ran until their cheeks flushed. Thomas watched from the bench, the same one with the chipped corner, and allowed himself to smile, not the polite kind, but the kind that starts from somewhere deep. Sarah sat beside him, arms crossed, eyes cautious. "Do you think they'll understand one day?" she asked. Thomas nodded slowly. "Maybe not today, maybe not even soon, but children, they have a way of understanding things we adults can't. They don't carry shame. They don't know how to lie to themselves yet." Sarah exhaled, a mix of relief and sorrow. "I never wanted Danny to grow up without a father, but I also didn't want to beg for space in someone else's life." Thomas turned to her, his voice steady. "You won't have to anymore." He meant it. For the first time, he saw clearly. This wasn't about undoing the past. It was about choosing a better future. That night, Back at the house, he called the family meeting. No lawyers, no paperwork, just hearts laid bare. Michael apologized, not with flowers or speeches, but with tears, with the kind of silence that only men who've made terrible mistakes know how to sit in it. And then, to everyone's surprise, he turned to Danny and knelt down. "I'm sorry I wasn't there," he said, "but I'm here now, and I want to know you, if you'll let me." Danny looked at him, eyes wide, and then slowly reached out his hand. Not a hug, not yet, but a beginning. And sometimes, beginnings are more powerful than endings. For a brief moment, it felt like healing was finally possible. Thomas began to believe that maybe, just maybe, the wounds of the past could become the roots of something stronger. Danny and Eli were inseparable now. They drew together, played together, even began calling each other bro. Michael had been making an effort to picking Danny up from school, visiting Sarah's apartment, and sitting through the awkward silences that always come with rebuilding bridges. Sarah, cautious but hopeful, allowed him space, and Thomas, he had never felt more needed. For years, his wealth was the only thing people sought from him, but now it was his presence, his steadiness, his ability to hold chaos in his chest without letting it spill over. The family was wounded, but it was standing. And yet, beneath the surface, another storm was building. Her name was Lauren, Michael's wife, a woman who had built her world on trust and tradition. She adored Eli, hosted school fundraisers, and believed her marriage was honest, stable. She had no idea that a secret child existed, no idea that her husband had lied by omission, not just to her, but to himself. When Michael finally told her at Thomas's insistence, the illusion shattered. Lauren didn't cry at first. She just stared at him, eyes hard and unreadable. "How long have you known?" she asked, her voice icy. "Since you found out about your father, or since the park?" Michael hesitated. "Since the park," he admitted. That broke her. "You looked me in the eye and said everything was fine. You let Eli play with him. You let me smile at that woman, while all of you shared this secret behind my back." The fallout was immediate. Lauren packed a bag, took Eli, said she needed time, maybe more than time. Thomas tried to speak with her, but she wouldn't listen. Sarah, who had just begun to trust again, now felt exposed, like a bomb had gone off that she never planted, but somehow had. "To survive, I knew this would happen," she said, shaking her head. "This was never going to be clean." Michael, crushed under guilt, turned to Thomas. "I thought we were fixing it. I thought I could handle this." But Thomas, with more years behind him than ahead, knew the truth. Healing doesn't come without consequences. And sometimes, before things get better, they get much, much worse. Now, it wasn't just about the children. It was about what kind of men they would become, depending on what the men before them chose to do next. The house felt different without Eli's laughter echoing down the hallways. Thomas could feel it in the silence, the kind that doesn't soothe, but stings. It had been for days since Lauren took Eli and left. 4 days of unanswered texts, awkward check-ins, and broken routines. Michael looked hollow. He went to work, came home, stared at the walls, repeated. But the one who felt it most was Danny. He sat by the window every afternoon, waiting, asking, "Is Eli coming today?" And Thomas, each time, forced a smile. He didn't feel and said, "Not today, buddy, but soon." Because what else do you say to a child who finally found a brother, only to have him ripped away by adult decisions he doesn't understand? One afternoon, Thomas picked Danny up from school and took him to the park, the same bench, the same chipped corner. He pulled out a small photo from his coat pocket, one of Eli and Danny from a week ago, arms slung over each other's shoulders, both grinning like they had no care in the world. "What do you see here?" Thomas asked. Danny looked at it closely, then smiled faintly. "Us. Happy." Thomas nodded. "And what do you feel when you look at it?" Danny paused. "Like I miss him." Thomas placed a hand on the boy's back. "Me too." There was a long silence before Danny whispered, "Did I do something wrong?" And that broke Thomas. "No, son. You did everything right. It's the grown-ups who are still learning." And in that moment, Thomas wasn't just a grandfather. He was a guardian of innocence, of hope, of a bond too sacred to let die. That night, Thomas sat at his desk and began to write. Not a letter of apology, not a legal statement, but a story for Eli. A story of two brothers who found each other when the world least expected it. A story about trains and parks, and peanut butter sandwiches, about secrets uncovered, and families rebuilt, and the courage to face hard truths. He placed the story in an envelope and delivered it to Lauren's mailbox himself. No name, no return address, just the title, The Day I Met My Brother. A week passed before there was a response. A knock at the door. It was Lauren, eyes tired, face softer. She didn't speak, just stepped aside. And there he was, Eli, holding the story in his small hands. "Grandpa," he said, "I read it. I want to go see Danny." And just like that, something that had fractured began to heal again. The reunion happened quietly. No speeches, no big gestures. Just two little boys running across the park toward each other, as if the days apart had been years. Eli dropped his backpack halfway across the grass and tackled Danny in a hug so tight, Thomas felt something in his chest crack open. There were no questions between them, no need for explanations. Kids don't need to understand DNA or family trees. They just know what connection feels like. "I missed you," Eli said. Danny beamed. "I saved your truck." And with that, the two brothers were back, side by side, building castles in the dirt and dreaming up worlds where no one ever had to say goodbye again. Lauren stayed in the background, arms crossed, watching. She was still cautious, but her walls were softening. Thomas approached her slowly, careful not to push. "Thank you for bringing him," he said gently. She nodded. "He hasn't smiled like that since we left." They stood in silence for a moment, both watching the boys. "I didn't want to hate anyone," she finally said. "I just didn't know what to do with the pain." Thomas placed a hand over his heart. "You did what any mother would do. You protected your child. But what if? Now, we've protected something bigger. This bond they have, it's not going away. Maybe it was never meant to." Lauren's eyes shimmered, but she didn't cry. "Not yet. Let's just take it one day at a time," she said. And Thomas agreed. One day at a time was more than enough. Later that afternoon, Sarah arrived. Danny ran to her, pulling her by the hand toward Eli. "This is my mom," he said proudly. Eli looked up at her and smiled. "You're nice," he declared. Sarah laughed. "Well, I try to be." The four adults stood in an uneven circle, imperfect, hesitant, but united by something far stronger than appearances. Truth. Michael arrived last. He stood at a distance for a while, watching everything unfold. Then, slowly, he walked toward the group. There was no applause, no dramatic reconciliation, but Sarah didn't turn away. Lauren didn't flinch, and for the first time, Michael didn't speak from defense or guilt. He simply said, "Can we try again?" No one answered right away, but Eli and Danny took each other's hands and began to draw in the dirt together, two names, side by side. And that was the beginning. That evening, after the park emptied and the children fell asleep in the back seat of their respective cars, Thomas returned home to the quiet that once haunted him. But now, it felt different, softer, full of echoes instead of absence. He sat at his old writing desk, opened a fresh leather-bound journal, and began to write. Not for lawyers, not for the family trust, but for Eli and Danny. "To my grandsons," he wrote at the top, "hand steady, by blood, by choice, by truth." He poured everything into those pages. Stories of his childhood, lessons from his failures, the weight of his regrets, and the beauty he had found in second chances. He didn't leave instructions. He left reflections, warnings about silence, encouragement about forgiveness, reminders that being a man wasn't about strength or status, but about courage, the kind that shows up when it's hardest to speak. He wrote through the night, the fireplace burning low beside him. He spoke of Rachel, of how love sometimes arrives before we're ready for it, of how fear can silence even the loudest hearts. He wrote about Michael, how raising him had been the greatest contradiction of his life, a son who wasn't his by blood, but whom he loved more fiercely than any logic could explain. And then he wrote about the boys, about how they reminded him of what matters. "You both were born from different storms," he wrote, "but somehow you found each other in the same clearing." His hands trembled as he signed the final page. "Don't let the world tell you who your family is. Build it yourselves, and never forget the cost of truth, or the reward of it." He closed the journal and sealed it with a ribbon, red, like the color of memory, like the color of blood. The next day, Thomas invited everyone for dinner. No occasion, just a table long enough to fit the mess of what they'd become, and the miracle of it too. He cooked himself, refusing help. Roast chicken, sweet potatoes, the the same peach cobbler Rachel once made him on a summer afternoon in 1973. Michael brought wine, Sarah brought flowers, Lauren, after a long pause at the door, brought Eli and the boys. They brought laughter. They sat side by side, arms bumping, fighting over mashed potatoes, as if nothing had ever happened, or as if everything had, and they had already forgiven it all. At the end of the meal, Thomas placed the journal in the center of the table. "It's not for today," he said quietly. "It's for someday, when you're ready, when you need to remember what this all meant." No one opened it. No one needed to. The silence said enough. Years later, the old house stood quiet again. The same creaky steps, the same porch swing that groaned softly in the wind. But inside, it held a different silence now. Not the heavy, hollow kind that comes from regret, but the sacred stillness of memory. Thomas had passed peacefully one winter morning, seated in his armchair by the window, a blanket over his lap, and the last rays of sunrise warming his skin. He hadn't left behind headlines or empires, just a tightly woven family and a sealed leather journal marked only with two initials, E and D. It was found among his things, untouched since the day he placed it at the center of the table. No one had dared open it, not until now. Eli and Danny were both in their 20s. They stood in the attic together, side by side, the journal between them. Life had taken them in different directions, Eli into teaching, Danny into carpentry. But they still met every Sunday for lunch, a promise made long ago. They opened the journal together, reverently. The handwriting hadn't faded. The words were still sharp, and with each line, they heard their grandfather's voice, his lessons, his confessions, his hopes. And with each page, they remembered who they were, not just by name or blood, but by the choices that shaped them. They read the final sentence in silence. "You were my redemption, both of you, and if I did one thing right in this world, it was loving you enough to tell the truth." Eli closed the journal, wiping his eyes. "He really carried all of this alone," he said. Danny nodded, his throat tight, but not forever. They sat on the attic floor for a long time, no rush to go anywhere. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, the same trees they had played under as boys. Below them, in the kitchen, the clock ticked softly, unchanged. Life had moved forward. People had come and gone. But the truth remained, not in DNA, not in inheritance, but in the laughter of two brothers who were never supposed to meet, and yet somehow were always meant to find each other. And in the heart of it all was a man who had made peace with his past, not by hiding it, but by choosing to face it and love through it until the very end.